Imagine a 4-year-old attempting suicide. It's just heartbreaking to even think about, right? That's what really got me thinking about this deep dive this week. We're going way beyond just the statistics and really trying to understand what's going on in the mind of someone who's having suicidal thoughts. Are there patterns that we can see?
Yeah, it is a tough topic, but I think it's a crucial one. And you're right, the statistics only give us a little glimpse of the bigger picture. What's fascinating to me, though, is even across different age groups, different cultures and even different time periods, you see these common threads that keep popping up in suicidal behavior. And I think unraveling those threads is really what we're going to be trying to do today. And we've got a really interesting mix of sources, a deep dive into this book called Psychotherapy with Suicidal People. But we're going to be using real case studies, expert opinions to try to, add some more color to this.
Okay, so this psychotherapy with suicidal people, that's the real, backbone of our deep dive today. And it's really interesting how it's structured. Each chapter is kind of dedicated to a different age group.
Yeah.
And within each chapter, they've got, a bunch of case studies of people who have either attempted suicide or, completed suicide. But one of the things that really struck me in the introduction was how much the author emphasizes the therapist-patient relationship. It's really about understanding each person's unique story, their own experience, and how they got to that point.
It makes a lot of sense to focus on those individual stories because, suicide is very rarely caused by just one thing. It's more like this perfect storm of internal struggles, external pressures, and also how a person has learned to cope or not cope with all the difficulties that life throws at us.
Yeah, and it's not just theory. This book really gets into some tough cases, and one that really blew my mind was a 4-year-old boy named Justin who attempted suicide. And it just makes you realize that this can affect anyone at any age. We tend to think of it as something that, maybe teenagers or adults go through, but it's so much more complex than that.
Yeah, it's a stark reminder that even young children can experience this really deep emotional pain. And a lot of times they lack the language or the coping skills to really deal with that in a healthy way.
So we know that every suicide is unique, but I'm curious, are there any patterns? Are there things we can learn from looking at these cases as a whole? And I know the book talks about these commonalities. Are those recurring themes that pop up in the thoughts, feelings, and circumstances of people who've died by suicide?
Yeah, and those commonalities aren't about trying to predict who will attempt suicide. It's more about trying to understand, the mindset, the patterns of thinking that might lead someone down that path. Think about it like this. If we can recognize those patterns early on, then we might be able to intervene in a more effective way.
Okay, I'm all ears. What are some of these commonalities that the book digs into?
Well, the first one is what the author calls inability to adjust. And the book says that nearly 90% of suicides are linked to some kind of mental health issue. But it's not just about having a diagnosis, it's about how someone is coping or not coping with that mental health challenge. Are they able to get support treatment, coping mechanisms, or are they just feeling totally overwhelmed and trapped?
That makes sense. It's not about the diagnosis itself. It's about how that diagnosis is affecting someone's ability to function, to cope, to see a way forward.
Right. And that leads us to the next commonality, which the author calls constriction.
Yeah.
Have you ever felt so stressed, so overwhelmed that you kind of get tunnel vision? Like you can only focus on the problem and every single solution just seems impossible?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think we've all been there at some point. That feeling of being totally trapped with no way out.
Now imagine that feeling, but 100 times worse. That's kind of what constriction can be like for someone who's suicidal. It's like their whole world shrinks down to just that one problem. And suicide becomes the only escape that they can see.
It's almost like that fight or flight response.
Yeah.
But instead of fighting or fleeing, they just feel completely frozen, trapped by their own thoughts.
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it. And that feeling of being trapped, of having no other options, it's a huge factor in so many suicides.
Okay, so we've got inability to adjust. We've got constriction. What else does the book highlight?
Well, the next one is really interesting. It's called rejection aggression. And the idea here is that the pain of rejection, whether it's real or just perceived, it can actually turn inward and become self-destructive. It's like the aggression that would normally be directed outwards towards the person who rejected them. It gets turned against themselves.
Oh, so instead of getting mad at the person who rejected them, they end up feeling angry at themselves.
In a way, yeah. But it's a lot more complex than that. It's about this deep internalization of that rejection, this feeling of being unworthy, unlovable, or just fundamentally flawed. And that can be incredibly destructive.
That's such an interesting point. We talk a lot about the importance of self-esteem, But we don't always acknowledge how deeply rejection can affect someone's sense of self-worth.
And for someone who's in a suicidal state, those feelings of rejection are often magnified. They're distorted and they're taken to an extreme. So what might seem like a really minor slight to someone else can feel absolutely devastating to someone who's already struggling.
So it's not just about the rejection itself, it's about how that rejection is interpreted, how it feeds into those pre-existing feelings of vulnerability and worthlessness.
Exactly. And that's where empathy becomes so important. It's about trying to understand the world through their eyes, to see how that rejection, however small it might seem to us, can feel like the final straw.
Okay, so we've got inability to adjust, we've got constriction and rejection, aggression. What's that fourth commonality that the book talks about?
The last one is identification aggression. It's a little more abstract, but stick with me. Imagine someone who's lost someone they deeply loved, or maybe they've lost a job or a dream that was really central to their identity. They become so fixated on that loss, so identified with it, that they start to see suicide as a way to escape the pain.
So it's not just about the grief or the loss itself, it's about how that loss becomes like intertwined with their sense of self, their sense of purpose.
Right. They might see suicide as a way to reunite with that lost person, to regain that lost ideal, or to just escape this world that now feels empty and meaningless without it. It's this way of trying to transcend the pain, but it's a tragically misguided way.
It's almost like they're trying to merge with that lost person or that lost ideal, to become one with it again, even if it means leaving this world behind.
Yeah, that's a really insightful way to put it. And it highlights how important it is to help people find other ways to cope with loss, to grieve in healthy ways, and to create a new sense of purpose and meaning in their lives.
Okay, so now that we have a little bit of a grasp of these commonalities, let's go back to that case study that I mentioned earlier that really shook me. That 4-year-old boy, Justin. Can we connect his story back to these patterns we've been discussing?
Absolutely. So remember, Justin was living in a home where his parents were fighting constantly. So he was exposed to a lot of anger, a lot of turmoil, and it was clearly having a negative impact on him. He was starting to act out, showing signs of anxiety and distress.
And then one day he started talking about wanting to disappear. It's chilling to think about a child that young expressing those kinds of thoughts.
It is heartbreaking, but it's also a reminder that even young children can experience suicidal thoughts. And, we as adults need to be aware of those signs and take them seriously.
Absolutely. So how do we connect Justin's case back to those commonality?
Well, let's start with inability to adjust. A child's world is largely defined by their family and their home environment. So when that environment is chaotic and unpredictable, it can be incredibly difficult for a child to adjust. They might feel unsafe, insecure, and just unable to cope with all that emotional turmoil that they're witnessing.
That makes a lot of sense. It's not just about the fighting itself. It's about the lack of stability, the lack of security that a child needs to thrive.
Right. And think about rejection aggression. Even though his parents weren't directly rejecting Justin, the constant fighting could have created this sense of emotional rejection. He might have felt like he wasn't being seen or heard or understood. And that feeling of rejection, combined with not being able to express his anger outwardly, could have turned inward and led to those self-destructive thoughts.
So it's like he was absorbing all that negative energy, all that anger and frustration, and because he didn't have the words or the skills to express it, it turned inwards. It became self-directed aggression.
That's a great way to think about it. And then there's constriction. He was fixated on this idea of wanting to disappear to escape the pain that he was feeling. And he couldn't see any other solutions, any other ways to cope. His world had shrunk down to just that one overwhelming problem, and suicide seemed like the only way out.
It's a stark reminder that children often have a limited understanding of death and suicide. They might not grasp the permanence of it. They might see it as a way to simply escape a difficult situation without fully understanding the consequences.
And that's why it's so crucial to intervene early, to provide support and guidance, and to help children develop those healthy coping mechanisms. We need to create environments where they feel safe, loved, and empowered to express their emotions in healthy ways.
Okay, so we've explored Justin's case in detail now. I know the book goes on to look at all sorts of case studies across different life stages. To give our listeners a little bit broader perspective, can you briefly outline one or two more cases that really illustrate how these common threads manifest differently across ages?
Sure. Let's take Jeff. He was a troubled teenager who was struggling with isolation and depression. He'd recently moved with his family from the city to the country, and that transition hit him really hard. Imagine being uprooted from all your friends, your familiar surroundings, and being thrust into this brand new environment. He felt like a total outsider, disconnected, lost.
I can see how that would be just a recipe for isolation and despair, especially during those teenage years when those social connections are so important.
Exactly. And on top of that, he was dealing with underlying depression and anxiety, which were only amplified by the move. He was withdrawing, spending more and more time alone, lost in his own dark thoughts. It was a classic case of inability to adjust, compounded by constriction. He couldn't see a way out of his situation, and his thoughts were just spiraling downwards. He actually attempted suicide, and even though he showed some signs of improvement while he was in the hospital, he ultimately took his own life after being released.
It's a tragic reminder that even with intervention, even when there are glimmers of hope, suicide is just so complex and unpredictable.
It is. It's a reminder that we need to be vigilant, that we need to keep developing more effective prevention and intervention strategies. And we need to create a culture where seeking help for mental health issues isn't seen as a weakness, but as a sign of strength.
Well said. Okay, so we've got Justin's case, a young child struggling with a really chaotic home environment. And Jeff's case, a teenager grappling with isolation and depression after a huge life change. What other case study comes to mind?
Well, let's talk about Peter.
Oh,
He was a middle-aged man who was going through a really difficult divorce. He had a history of trauma from his childhood, and the divorce seemed to just reopen all those old wounds. He was struggling with feelings of rejection, abandonment, and a lot of that past pain was
it
resurfacing.
sounds like a total perfect storm of triggers, a major life transition, the breakdown of a relationship, and the resurfacing of all that unresolved trauma.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it really highlights this concept of the suicidal career, this idea that suicide isn't just a spontaneous act. It's often the culmination of a lifetime of experiences, coping mechanisms, and all those unresolved wounds that can linger beneath the surface.
So it's not just about what's happening in the present moment. It's about all those layers of past experience, those patterns of coping or not coping with pain and loss that can make someone more vulnerable during a crisis.
That's exactly it. Peter's story, unlike Jeff's, was characterized by outward anger and impulsivity. He was lashing out at others, engaging in risky behaviors, and really struggling to contain all of that emotional turmoil. It was a different manifestation of that rejection-aggression dynamic that we talked about before.
So instead of turning that aggression inwards, he was directing it outwards, but it was still the reflection of that deep pain, that feeling of being rejected and abandoned.
Exactly. And just like the other cases, Peter's story underscores how important it is to understand each person's unique history, their patterns of coping, and that complex interplay of factors that can contribute to a suicidal crisis.
Okay, so we've explored three very distinct cases now: a child, a teenager, and a middle-aged man. And each of them illustrate how these common threads of suicide can show up in different ways depending on the person's age, their experiences, and their circumstances. What I'm taking away from this is that it's not just about recognizing the signs of suicidal thoughts, it's about understanding the person behind those thoughts, their story, their struggles, and the unique set of factors that have led them to that point.
Yeah, you've really hit the nail on the head. It's about moving beyond those simplistic explanations and approaching suicide with empathy, curiosity, and a genuine desire to understand just how complex the human experience really is. And that's where this book is so valuable. It not only explores those individual stories, but it also delves into the broader approaches to suicide prevention, the ethical considerations, and the societal factors that contribute to this whole complex issue.
Sounds like we have a lot more to unpack, but before we dive into those broader aspects, I want to shift gears a bit and talk about something that really intrigued me: the language of suicide. The book talks about how experts actually analyze suicide notes, looking for those hidden clues, those patterns of thinking and feeling that might offer some insights into what was going on in the person's mind before they died.
That's a really fascinating area of research, and it gets to the heart of how we understand and interpret suicidal communication. Suicide notes, when they are left behind, can offer this window into a person's internal world, their struggles, their pain, and their final message to the world. But they're also incredibly complex documents, often filled with symbolism, metaphors, and this mix of conscious and unconscious motivations.
It's like trying to put together a puzzle to decipher the code of their pain, their despair, and their final act.
Exactly. And it's not about finding easy answers or simple explanations. It's about approaching those notes with sensitivity, with respect for that person's story, and a genuine desire to understand the depths of their suffering.
Okay, so we've talked about these commonalities of suicide. We've explored some really compelling case studies, and we've touched on this intriguing world of analyzing suicide notes. I'm really eager to dive deeper into those broader aspects of suicide prevention, the ethical considerations, and the societal factors that contribute to this whole complex issue. But I think this is a good place to pause. For now, we'll pick up right where we left off in the next part of our deep dive.
Picking up on those suicide notes, it's not just about some morbid curiosity, right? It's about trying to understand those final messages, those last words, and maybe find some patterns, some insights that could help us prevent future tragedies. You
And
know,
I find that idea so fascinating that even in those final moments, there might be clues, messages that could help us understand the path that led someone to that point. But I know you said it's complex. The book mentions this tool called the Thematic Guide for Suicide Prediction, or the TGSP. It sounds like it's used to identify those common threads we've been talking about.
Mm.
But can you explain it in a way that, makes sense for someone who's never heard of it before?
Sure. Yeah, you can think of the TGSP like a detective's toolkit. It's not a magic formula that predicts suicide, but it helps experts analyze communication. And that could be suicide notes, it could be any kind of writing, even just conversations, to identify those patterns of thinking that we've been discussing, constriction, rejection, aggression, inability to adjust. By recognizing those themes early on, the hope is that we might be able to intervene before a crisis really escalates.
So instead of just looking at individual words or phrases,
Hmm.
the TGSP helps experts see the bigger picture, those underlying patterns of thinking that might signal a higher risk of suicide.
Exactly. It's about connecting the dots, understanding the context, and recognizing those subtle cues that might otherwise go unnoticed.
It's like those hidden messages in a painting. You
Yeah.
need to step back and see the whole canvas to really understand what the artist was trying to say.
That's a really great analogy. The TGSP helps us see the forest for the trees, to move beyond those surface level interpretations and dig into the deeper meaning behind the words.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So we've talked about understanding the suicidal mind, those commonalities, and even analyzing those final messages. But what about prevention? The book talks about some broader strategies as well, right? What really stood out to you in that area?
Well, what's striking is that suicide prevention isn't just about individual therapy, it's this multi-layered challenge that requires us to think about, individual, community, even societal levels of intervention.
So it's not just about treating the individual, it's about creating a safer and more supportive environment for everyone.
Precisely. And one of the key strategies that the book highlights is means restriction. So think about it. If someone is in crisis, having easy access to lethal means can be the difference between life and death. For example, reducing access to firearms has been shown to really reduce suicide rates.
So it's about creating those barriers, those moments of pause that might give someone a chance to reconsider, to reach out for help or for the crisis to maybe subside a little bit.
Exactly. Sometimes that extra obstacle, that little moment of hesitation, can be enough to break the chain of events that might lead to a tragedy. And, means restriction isn't just about firearms. It can also apply to things like medications, access to bridges or high places, and other potentially lethal methods.
Okay, so we've got individual therapy, we've got means restrictions. What else can we do at a community level?
I think creating a culture of support is so crucial. Think about those social connections that we were talking about earlier. Isolation is a huge risk factor for suicide. So fostering strong social networks, community involvement, and a sense of belonging can be incredibly protective.
So it's about building those support systems, those lifelines that can help people get through tough times.
Exactly. And that can involve everything from encouraging people to reach out to friends and family to promoting community events and activities that foster connection to supporting mental health initiatives and organizations.
And what about those broader societal factors? I know the book talks about things like poverty, discrimination, and access to mental health care.
Yeah, addressing those systemic issues is absolutely critical. Poverty, unemployment, lack of education, discrimination, all of those things contribute to a sense of hopelessness and despair, which can increase suicide risk. So we really need to advocate for policies and programs that create a more equitable and just society where everyone has the opportunity to thrive.
So suicide prevention isn't just about individual actions. It's about working towards a fairer and more just world where everyone has the chance to really live a fulfilling life.
Absolutely. It's about understanding that, our individual well-being is really intertwined with the well-being of our communities and our society as a whole.
Now, I know the book also touches on some of the ethical challenges surrounding suicide. What are some of the key issues that come up in that area?
Well, one of the biggest challenges is trying to balance individual autonomy with the responsibility to protect that. So imagine a therapist who's working with someone who's expressing suicidal thoughts. They have a duty to protect their client, but they also have to respect their client's right to make their own decisions. It's this really delicate balancing act.
It's like navigating a moral maze. You want to respect someone's freedom of choice, but you also have this responsibility to prevent harm.
Exactly. And those ethical dilemmas can get really, really complex. How much intervention is appropriate? When is it okay to break confidentiality? What are the legal implications of involuntary hospitalization? These are really tough questions with no easy answers.
It's a reminder that working in this field, you need more than just, specialized knowledge and skills.
Hmm.
You also need a deep sense of compassion, ethical awareness, and a commitment to navigating those complex situations with sensitivity and wisdom.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it highlights how important it is to have these ongoing dialogues and collaborations among mental health professionals, ethicists, policymakers, and the community as a whole. We need to be having those tough conversations, grappling with those ethical dilemmas, and working together to create a system of care that's both effective and compassionate.
Okay, so we've explored those commonalities of suicide. We've talked about some really, difficult case studies. We've touched on this fascinating world of suicide notes and discussed those broader approaches to prevention and the ethical considerations that come with all of that. I have to admit, I'm feeling a little overwhelmed by just the sheer complexity of this whole topic. Is there anything in the book that offers a glimmer of hope? A sense of what we can do to move forward?
Yeah, one thing that really stood out to me was this emphasis on really understanding each person's story, their unique journey, their pain, their motivations. It's not about fitting people into neat categories or applying one-size-fits-all solutions. It's about recognizing the humanity behind the statistics, the person behind the diagnosis.
It's about seeing them as individuals, not just as cases or numbers.
Exactly. And it's about remembering that even in those really dark times, there's always hope. Hope for healing, hope for connection, hope for a brighter tomorrow.
So it's about fostering that hope, both in the people who are struggling and in ourselves.
And it's about recognizing that suicide prevention isn't just the responsibility of mental health professionals. It's a collective effort that requires the involvement of families, communities, schools, workplaces, and society as a whole.
It's about creating this culture of care where we're really attuned to the struggles of those around us, where we reach out to people who are hurting, and where we offer support without judgment.
It's about breaking down the barriers of stigma, fostering open and honest conversations about mental health, and providing resources and support to those who are in need.
It's about recognizing that suicide is a preventable tragedy, and that we all have a role to play in saving lives.
One of the things that struck me in the book was this emphasis on the importance of hope.
You mean like that belief that things can get better, that there's a light at the end of the tunnel?
Exactly. Hope is such a powerful antidote to despair, and it's a crucial element in suicide prevention.
Yeah, and the book talks about helping people reconnect with their own inner resources, their strengths, and their reasons for living.
It's about reminding them that they're not alone, that there are people who care, and that there are supports available to help them through those dark times.
It's about offering that glimmer of light, that sense of possibility, and that belief that healing and recovery are within reach.
One of the things the book explores is the role of spirituality and meaning-making in suicide prevention.
You mean how people can find solace and purpose in their connection to something bigger than themselves?
Exactly. Spirituality can take so many different forms, from traditional religion to a connection with nature to just a belief in a higher power.
And it's not about imposing any one particular belief system, right? It's about helping people explore their own spiritual beliefs and values as a source of strength and resilience.
Right. And meaning making is also a crucial part of healing. It's about helping people find a sense of purpose, to connect with their values, and to create a narrative that gives their lives significance.
It's about helping them rediscover those things that make life worth living, those sources of joy, connection, and purpose that can fuel their journey towards recovery.
Now, the book also explores the role of creativity and self-expression in suicide prevention.
You mean how people can use art, music writing, or other creative outlets to process their emotions, to find meaning, and to connect with others?
Exactly. Creative expression can be so therapeutic. It provides this safe and healthy way to channel those really intense feelings, to explore difficult emotions, and to communicate experiences that might be hard to put into words.
It's about finding those outlets, those channels of expression that allow people to tap into their inner world, to find their voice, and to share their story.
And in that sharing, in that connection, they can often find healing and hope.
Now, the book also talks about the importance of self-care for the people who are working with suicidal individuals.
Right. It's this reminder that those of us who are on the front lines of suicide prevention need to take care of ourselves both physically and emotionally.
Yeah, it's a really demanding and emotionally draining field, and it's so important that we have our own supports in place, that we practice self-compassion, and that we seek help when we need it.
Burnout is a real risk in this field, and it's crucial that we prioritize our own well-being so that we can continue to show up for those who are struggling.
Absolutely. Now, shifting gears a bit, the book also delves into the history of suicide, exploring how different cultures and societies have viewed this phenomenon over time.
It's fascinating to see how perspectives on suicide have evolved over the centuries, from ancient Greece, where it was sometimes seen as a noble act, to the Middle Ages, when it was often condemned as a sin.
And those cultural and societal views can have a huge impact on how we understand and approach suicide today.
Absolutely. For example, in some cultures, suicide is still heavily stigmatized, which can make it even harder for people to reach out for help.
It's about recognizing those cultural nuances and approaching suicide with sensitivity and understanding.
One of the things that struck me in the book was the discussion of the role of philosophy in understanding suicide.
You mean those big existential questions about the meaning of life, the nature of suffering, and the right to choose death?
Exactly. Philosophers have been grappling with these questions for centuries, and their insights can offer really valuable perspectives on the complex motivations and ethical dilemmas that surround suicide.
Yeah, the book highlights the work of Albert Camus, who famously wrote about the absurdity of life and the individual's freedom to choose in the face of meaninglessness.
Camus's work raises these profound questions about the nature of existence and the right to self-determination.
But it's important to remember that Camus himself didn't advocate for suicide. He believed that even in the face of that absurdity, we can find meaning and purpose through rebellion, through engagement with the world, and through our connection to other people.
It's about finding those sources of meaning, those anchors of hope that can sustain us through life's challenges.
Now, the book also touches on the legal and ethical implications of suicide. Exploring how tricky it can be to determine someone's mental capacity to make those life-or-death decisions.
Yeah, those are incredibly complex issues, and there are often no easy answers. But they really highlight how important it is to have open and honest conversations about suicide, both within the medical community and within society as a whole.
It's about moving beyond that stigma and approaching suicide with empathy and understanding. We need to create spaces where people can talk about their struggles, their pain, without fear of judgment.
And we need to equip ourselves with the knowledge and resources to recognize the signs of suicide risk and to intervene effectively.
Absolutely. So as we kind of dig deeper into the book's exploration of suicide, it becomes clear that understanding those common threads, those recurring patterns, is really just the starting point. It's like having a map, but the terrain itself is so vast and varied.
It's a reminder that this is a journey, not a destination. And it's a journey that requires not just knowledge, but also compassion, curiosity, and a willingness to grapple with the complexities of human experience.
Okay, I think we've covered a lot of ground here. We've gone from exploring those common threads in the suicidal mind to looking at individual cases to examining the ethical and societal implications of suicide. But there's one thing I'm still a little bit fuzzy on. The book mentions this idea of a suicidal career, and I'm not sure I fully get what that means. Can you kind of unpack that a bit more for me?
Yeah, that idea of a suicidal career, it's kind of a heavy term, right? But it's not about someone having a job as a suicide or anything like that. It's more about recognizing that there can be these long-term patterns in a person's life that make them more vulnerable. Think about it this way. We all develop ways of dealing with stress, pain, loss, all the hard stuff that comes with being alive. But for some people, those coping mechanisms, those ways of dealing with things, they might not be so healthy in the long run. They might even become self-destructive.
So it's like those patterns, those habits of how we deal with life's challenges, they can actually increase the risk of suicidal thoughts, especially during times of crisis when things are already really tough.
Exactly. And it's not about blaming the person. It's about understanding that their suicidal career, so to speak, could have really deep roots. Maybe going all the way back to childhood experiences, trauma, or even just those early ways they learn to deal with really difficult emotions.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like those early experiences create a blueprint, a roadmap for how someone navigates pain and hard times. And if that roadmap keeps leading them down a path of self-destruction, we need to help them redraw it, find new routes, find healthier ways of coping.
And that's where therapy support groups and other interventions can be so powerful. It's about helping people identify those unhealthy patterns, develop new coping skills, and build up their resilience so they can weather those storms.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into this topic, it's heavy, it's complex. What are some of the key things you want listeners to walk away with?
Well, I hope people will remember that suicide, it's incredibly personal. It's often a very isolating experience, but it doesn't happen out of nowhere. It's shaped by so many things. Those common threads we've been talking about, but also social, cultural, even historical factors, all these forces kind of come together.
It's like we need to zoom in and zoom out to really understand it. See the individual trees, but also the whole forest. The
Mm,
personal experiences, but also the big picture.
exactly.
Mm.
And I hope people listening will come away with this sense of, wow, it's complicated, but also there's hope. We can't predict suicide with 100% certainty, but we can create a world where people feel more connected, more supported. A world where they feel like they can reach out for help when they're struggling without shame.
It's like recognizing that each of us has a role to play in building that kind of world,
Yeah.
right? A world where mental health is something we value, where asking for help is a sign of strength, and where people who are hurting know that they're not alone.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Suicide prevention. It's not just on the shoulders of therapists and doctors, it's on all of us. It starts with understanding empathy and just that willingness to reach out to someone who's hurting. And, if we can do that, we can create that culture of care and support. I truly believe we can save lives.
Well said. I think that's a really powerful message to end on. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive. It's been insightful and honestly, yeah, challenging at times. But I think it's so important to talk about these things. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this exploration of suicide. It's a tough topic, but a crucial one. We hope this conversation has given you some new insights, maybe even a sense of hope, and that you'll feel empowered to be part of creating a world where suicide is no longer this silent epidemic, but a challenge we can all face together, with compassion, understanding, and most importantly, with hope.